this message is Washington, that's President Washington, President Trump, and God's protection. Now, the sermon is about trusting God in tough situations. And
Dr. Rick, should we start over? This wasn't, it wasn't in focus. And we're
Okay.
going to just try to get it lined up and start again, I guess. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
Okay. We're ready.
Okay.
This sermon is about President Washington, President Trump, and God's protection. So you could say this sermon is about trusting God for our protection. We're going to start with the history lesson about George Washington. And he went with General Braddock during the early parts of the French and Indian War, which I guess he was intimately involved in. And he actually warned the general that, he said, these Indians, this is at the edge of the Ohio River, the Monongahela. But anyway, he says, and the French as well, he said, they don't play fair. I mean, what I call the European style of fighting lined up against each other. He said, they're more for ambushes. And by the way, that part of the wilderness had no roads. It was all heavy forested. So it's not like it is today. And most of this took place close to what we would call Pittsburgh today. Actually, George Washington was there the day they burned the big fort there, and then the British rebuilt it, named it for one of their leaders, Lord Pitt. So it became Fort Pitt, and eventually Pittsburgh. So you kind of know where it was. So he was a very ambitious young man. He got to be a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. And when the ambush happened, they shot all the officers. He was the only one to survive. At least that's how the historians say. And he led a rear guard, getting them out of there. And got the general out, although he was mortally wounded and died on his way back to Virginia. So imagine there are no good roads. It's not like it is today. It's a deep forest. And he became a hero when he got back to Virginia, got most of their people out alive from a terrible ambush. And of course, he fought in another battle, the Battle of Monongahela. That's the name. That and another river come together at Pittsburgh to form the Ohio River. And in both cases, an Indian chief said, the Great Spirit in the sky is keeping us from killing this guy. And there are historians who claim that Washington didn't push this story. Others pushed it and confirmed it. And that Indian chief was later an ally of America because the Indians switched sides between the British and the French. And he confirmed it. He said, we shot at Washington many times with braves, with good French rifles. They could shoot squirrels out of trees. They put 4 bullet holes in his jacket and shot 2 horses out from under him, and his hat got shot off a couple times. But Washington survived miraculously. And so the chief said he will be a great leader among his people. And he said that even before Washington did all the great things he did. And by the way, Washington did more great things than you imagine. I just recently learned that the reason they did the Declaration of Independence was because Washington encouraged it. Now, he let his neighbor Jefferson write it, but he's the one that said, we got to do this and get it in paper if we're going to fight the British. He's one of the main ones that started the Continental Congress because he was a leader in Virginia. I didn't even know that. Actually, he did so many things. But I'm saying that Indian chief was right, that the great spirits or God in heaven was protecting George Washington because he had a great work for Washington to do. And if you look at the history of America, when they started the Continental Congress, he said the British had shut down the legislature of Massachusetts and just recently shut down the legislature called the House of Burgess in Virginia, which bothered Washington. He said, look, if each of us 13 colonies argue with the British, we won't have any effect. We need a united Congress and face the British as united. And originally, they just wanted a better deal from Great Britain. I won't go into all the details. They just wanted a better deal. And the British were, King George was like, no. The point is that he didn't intend to revolt, but it just kind of led to it. But without him, there might not have been Declaration of Independence. Without him, there may not have been a Continental Congress. And everybody knows without him, they would not have won the American Revolution. Also, he was the only man who got 100% of all the electoral votes when he ran for president. And even though he was getting more political criticism after his second term, no one doubts that he wouldn't have won a third term if he wanted it. And most dictators in the world died in office. Nobody gave up power. He's the first one to say 2 years in the president, 2 terms is all the president should have. And in other words, America wouldn't exist without Washington. So you would have to admit what that chief thought and said was true. All those years in the American Revolution up front on his big white horse, and he never got killed. I'd have to say God protected him. Now I'm going to go to Donald Trump. And I know people say, making a comparison with Washington is bad for anybody. So I understand all that. But I understand that bullet, from an AR-15, the guy had a little triangle on the front. So you could, and by the way, not that it's a big deal, but I got a marksman medal in the Army. When you're laying prone with a good rifle, and you're not that far from the target, and all you have to learn is to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it, you will hit the bullseye. And I didn't know this till recently. Crook, the guy that shot him, he went to the range all the time and was a good shot. So it wasn't like he was some little kid who was just missing. He was a good shot. Probably, I'm giving my opinion, when he squeezed that trigger, he probably had the back of Trump's head right in the crosshair. And bullets travel real fast. So it's like a split second, Trump looked down and off, just enough that it scraped his ear. And ears bleed a lot, so it looked worse than it was. Probably even less than half an inch, and the back of his skull would have bursted open. I actually think he would have died almost instantly. Or at best, he would have been a vegetable. I don't think he would even survived it. Now, you're going to tell me, oh, that was just because the guy's a bad shot. And then he got off 7 more bullets. Now, he did hit, in the 7 more bullets, he killed 1 man and seriously injured 2 others. But probably, he might have thought when Trump bended over behind the podium that he had got him, but he was just trying to get some more bullets in to make sure. And I'm not so sure that there weren't people in our government who didn't mind letting something like that happen. But I know proving all that's going to be tricky business. I really believe that was too close, just a millisecond, and Trump would have been dead. I believe God is protecting him. Now, God protected George Washington because he had something for George Washington to do that was very important. And America's led the world as a shining city on the hill for almost 250 years, and obviously Washington gave it a great start. Now, maybe God has great things, or at least some important things for Trump to do. Now you're going to say, but you can't say that because you don't know. So I can't say that because I don't know, but that's what I think. And like the Indian chief said, the Great Spirit would not let us take this guy out, and we tried many times. And he went back to the French and Indian War. He was involved in 3 battles, deep in, back to Virginia and back deep into the woods. I think I said this, but when they finally took the stronghold of the French and Indians, they renamed it Fort Pitt, and now it's Pittsburgh. So if Trump was spared miraculously, Maybe God has a purpose for President Trump that may be significant in the decline of America. I'm trying to be optimistic. You know, people say, but no matter what happens in the next election, we are in some tough times coming ahead. But one thing you can say, if you look at 1773, when he helped start the Continental Congress, till America, at least in some respects, won the War of 1812, you'd have to say God was blessing America. And then America fulfilled the role of continent to continent and then becoming a world power not too many years after that. And then the greatest power in the world, you see that God had a reason for keeping George Washington alive. And the government is telling Trump he should not have any more outdoor rallies because it's hard to protect him. And I thought, wait a minute. Their job is to protect him and not dictate what he can and can't do. They're working for us, the taxpayers, to protect our candidate and not the candidate working for them. But Trump has had outdoor rallies since then, and he's implying he's going to keep having rallies. We'll see how that comes out. But I want to go back into the history of Israel. And there was an evil empire, the Assyrians, and some people think they're the progenitors of the Germanic tribes, but regardless, the Assyrians were from the north, and they had become the big power in the world. And Ahaz, the previous king, Hezekiah, had said, I don't want any trouble with them. I'm going to become a vassal state and pay them their heavy taxes they put on all the vassal states. And I think when I finish this story, we'll see the value of respecting God and trusting God. Respecting God and trusting God. Well, Hezekiah, unlike his father, his predecessor, he was a good king. He moved away from paganism and idolatry, and he had one of the greatest Passovers in the history of Israel. You'll all see it written in the Book of Kings and Chronicles. And at some point, he said, I'm not going to be a vassal king for the Assyrians. I want Israel to be independent. So he stopped paying it. You see, let us say we don't consider ourselves a vassal. And then the Assyrian army came with a vast army, crossed the Jordan River, heading right for Jerusalem. He said, oh, I must have made a mistake. His faith wavered a little bit, even though he was a good king. And he sent a big treasure of money to the Babylonians with an understanding, to the Assyrians with an understanding that they would not invade Jerusalem. And for some odd reason, when the Assyrian king saw the valuables that he gave him, he thought to himself, I don't have to keep any deal I made if he pays me off. He said, Jerusalem must be full of wealth and goodies. And maybe it was the devil in him, I don't know. He said, forget that agreement. We're going to go on and we're going to conquer Judah anyway. So now I'm reading 2 Kings 18, 17 to 20. I've edited out a few things, so it's not too long, but 2 Kings 18, 17. Then the king of Assyria with a great army came against Jerusalem to King Hezekiah, and they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they'd come up, they went, he had some of his major government workers stand by the aqueduct from the upper pool, which was on Fuller's Field. In other words, they stood in a position outside of arrow range, but near the city of Jerusalem, which was locked up. And the people on the wall, they wanted to see this big army surrounding the city. And so they started to call out that your foolish king thinks he can dare resist the might of the Assyrian army. You people are going to starve to death, and look what we did to your brothers in Samaria a decade or so ago. It was a tough siege, but they're all been taken away captive, and worse things might happen to you. You better surrender. Nobody can beat the great Assyrian king. It was kind of like war propaganda. And the king's agent said to them, speak to us in your language. We can speak your language, don't speak in Hebrew. And they said, no, we want the people on the wall to hear. Our king didn't come with this message just for the king and his delegates. We want all the people to hear it. In other words, they wanted to scare the people of Judah so they would start arguing with each other and maybe would surrender. Verse 18, and when they called to the king, thus says the great king, king of Assyria, what confidence is this in which you trust? You speak of having plans and power for war, but he had the biggest army in the world, the meanest and toughest, and I'm sure these guys were probably quite, everybody feared them. But they're mere words. In whom do you trust that you dare rebel against me? And that's the question, in whom do you trust? 2 Kings 18:30. And this goes on from a message from the king of Assyria. Nor let Hezekiah make you, he's saying this to the people of Jerusalem, trust in the Lord. And by the way, Lord there probably is best translated, well, it would probably be Yahweh, or in English, Jehovah, or Jehovah. And so we're going to use the English word. I realize that's not the language they spoke, but God can speak English, so he knows what he meant. So you trust Jehovah, because the others had names for their gods too. And Jehovah will surely deliver us. This city shall not be given in the hands of the king of Assyria. He said, you really trust that? He tried to frighten the people, to force a surrender. And so we have to ask ourselves, who do we ultimately trust for safety? We should trust God. I like what the three Jewish associates of Daniel said when they were about to be, they refused to worship the golden idol, and they're about to be thrown into the fire. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he wasn't used to people talking back. He said, well, great King Nebuchadnezzar, maybe our God will save us from the fire. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to your idol, no matter what. And Nebuchadnezzar was shocked. You trust that God? He told, heat up the furnace 7 times hotter than it should be. We'll show you what being burned up is. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar was shocked that God did. They trusted God, and he did save them. So ultimately, our safety belongs to God. And if a few of us become martyrs, that's actually to your credit. To be a martyr, you have to be a great person. I mean, it's considered to be a heroic martyr. But God will protect us. And a few may become heroic martyrs, but even in that, that's a great thing if you are a great martyr. Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I'm a little hoarse today, and probably not at my best. But he was trying to frighten the people. But we need to have our ultimate trust in God. For instance, some people, I trust my muscles, I'm strong. I trust my bank account, I've got money. Or I've got friends in high places, connections. Our trust should be in God. Not that it's wrong to have those other things, but they can only do so much for you. So 2 Kings 18:33. Now this is the king of the Assyrians talking. Has any of the gods of the nations at all delivered its land from the hand of, the great king of Assyria? 34. Where are the gods of, and then he rattles off some of the, I'm sure, wall cities he's taken. Hamath, Arpad. Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, or Hena, or Iva, or even Samaria? Did any of their gods save them? Well, the problem the Samaritans had, that's the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they had changed their religion, were worshiping the golden calf. By the way, did you notice there was a golden calf in the Olympic Open ceremony? It's almost like it was a subtle signal that we're going pagan in Paris. It's not that it was a big deal. Probably few people probably even noticed it or thought about it. A bull and a golden calf. But the only reason God let the Assyrians take out the northern 10, they had prophets warn them from Elijah and others. They just kept sticking with the golden calf and idolatry. And they even got deeper into Baal worship as well. They got rid of the Bible. You know, when they fired the Levites, when Jeroboam said, "We're getting rid of you Levites as priests," he fired them, and they all went to the southern kingdom. They were really getting rid of the Word of God, because supposedly, and it happened for a reasonable amount of time, the Levites knew God's laws, they knew God's rules, the way things were supposed to be done, because you didn't have a lot of books, because printing and books weren't available then, and even scrolls were expensive and only some had them. So they were like walking, talking Bible instructors. Well, when he got rid of them, that's like getting rid of the Bible. And he hired the lowest of men who would teach anything he wanted for money. A lady wrote a book called Shepherds for Hire, where she accuses a lot of pastors in this country working for the money, and they only preach what, anyway. But the point is, that happened to the northern 10. So God let him take them away. And you realize that all those countries had gods that weren't gods. They were just made of stone, and they were in the minds of the people. Oh, they're up on Mount Olympus or wherever they thought they were, up in the clouds somewhere. And this little idol is their representation. But they're nothing. They were just human myths. They were not real gods. And you can realize how that blasphemy would offend God. Verse 35, "Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their countries from my hand?" Now that's the Assyrian king. That Jehovah should deliver Jerusalem from my hand. And by the way, he also put that in a letter that they delivered to King Hezekiah. And the letter basically said, no one can save you from the vast army. And the king did two things. He sent his Secretary of State and some other officials to Isaiah the prophet to ask him to pray for God. And then he took the letter, he took the evil king's letter to the temple, and he prayed to God, and he said, look, God, they're blaspheming you and putting you on a level with those gods that aren't really gods. And naturally, when he came back from the temple, the message from Isaiah was, don't worry about it. Not one arrow from his army will hit the city of Jerusalem. And that, so remember, ask the true God, the God of creation, the God of the Sabbath, the God of the Bible. I want to tell a corny joke here just to throw it in. It's called a religious cowboy or devout cowboy. He kept a Bible in his back pocket. While he was going along his fence line, he had a big ranch, he lost his Bible. He couldn't find it. And so he prayed and asked God to return his Bible to him. And he couldn't believe his eyes. The next day he saw a chicken with his Bible in his beak. I don't know how that looks, but I can't believe it. What a miracle. I can't believe it. And the chicken starts talking. He says, what do you mean, miracle? Your name is written right in the leaf of the Bible. But miracles did happen. And like I said, and this King Hezekiah moved them from the paganism of Ahaz, his predecessor, to being, he probably didn't get rid of all the paganism because it's hard to root it all out, but he moved them in a much better direction. And he stopped paying tribute to Assyria, and this all happened on the Passover. I mean, this final prayer, and happened on the. Previously they had the best Passover ever, but this was another Passover. And of course, the Passover is the time when the Jewish people were freed from Egypt, and the greedy king was going to make an example of Jerusalem. Plus, he believed it had great wealth, But he had another reason for scaring the people on that day. The Egyptians did come out. They were led by, I hope I get my names right, the Lower Egypt, and that's Ethiopia and surrounding area. He was in charge of the Egyptian empire at that time. So the Ethiopians and the Egyptians in a pretty big army came out to push against the Assyrians, who wanted to be a world empire. But you couldn't be a world empire until you take out Egypt. And actually, the empire that came after them, and this is the beginning of their decline, did do that, took out Egypt as well. But they sent out a big army to push back. So the king of Assyria says, I don't want my army split between fighting the Egyptians and sieging Jerusalem. So let's pour on the scary propaganda and get them to surrender without a fight. And then we'll have their resources to use against the Egyptians. But Hezekiah kept trusting God. He wasn't going to surrender no matter the threats. And we should learn to trust God. Even though a vast, hardened enemy army surrounds the city. 2 Kings 19:9. 2 Kings 19:9. And the king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, look, he has come out to make war with you. Messengers to Hezekiah saying, in other words, that was to the king of Assyria. I'm skipping a few words to just get to the basics. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying Jerusalem shall not be given to the hand of the king of Assyria. Look, you've heard what the king of Assyria have done to all those other lands, and their gods couldn't do a thing to help them. They were utterly destroyed, and you're going to be next. But King Hezekiah stuck with trusting God, kept the gates shut, and he believed what Isaiah told him. And when he took that blasphemous letter and prayed about it in the temple, he probably felt God is going to be here to save me, to protect me. And I wonder, as George Washington heard those stories from the Indian chief, I'm just saying this, I wonder if that emboldened him in his later campaigns, both in the French and Indian War and in the long American Revolution, which was America's longest war, I guess, until recently. You could maybe argue some of the Middle East stuff, they've been involved, but in real wars, it's been the longest war. All those 8 years that he was not going to die. I wonder if that gave him the courage, believing that God had been protecting him. Well, Hezekiah believed it. 2 Chronicles 32:20. Now because of this, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, prayed and cried out to heaven. Then Jehovah sent an angel to cut down every mighty man of the Assyrian army. Now, here's what I think happened. This is on the Passover night. Now, if you remember what happened in Egypt, at midnight, the death angel came. It passed over the Israelites, but it killed all the firstborn in Egypt. I bet it was the same death angel. I mean, I don't know, that doesn't matter, but probably was the same death angel, Passover night, and almost less than 200,000 soldiers, but his entire army just dropped dead at once. They went to sleep and never woke up. They're just gone. And the king of Assyria came back with a smaller group to see what was going on in Jerusalem, and they looked at different tents, and all his men were dead. I mean, they were just dead, like God just turned them off. They were gone. And I'll read the rest of it here. The king of Assyria, because all his soldiers were dead, or most of them, he had another smaller army somewhere else. He returned shamefaced to his own land, back to Nineveh. And when he had gone into the temple of his god, Nisroch, son of his own offsprings, one of his sons, struck him down with the sword. And interesting. And they say he had been praying to Nisroch, some weird-looking god. He said, how come Judah's God does great miracles for them, and you've never done any great miracles like that for me? And of course, he didn't and hasn't. So as I think about this message, think about how valuable George Washington was to American history. And even if you say, well, George Washington, historians was a very ambitious young man and took advantage of his opportunities, and he married into high society, and yeah, he was ambitious, but he was a real leader. That doesn't mean he's perfect, but he was a real leader of men, and all that becomes clear when you look at all that happened. I would argue that I'm not saying Donald Trump is another George Washington, because I don't think there is another George Washington, but I think Donald Trump is a real leader. And we don't have real leaders now. We have puppets. And if this offends anybody who hears the sermon, feel free to email me. I could be wrong, obviously, but I believe Trump is a real leader. And when he was coming up, his older brother was in charge of the apartment building, housing business that his father had started. And actually, his grandfather got the money to start it, but that's another story. But his older brother was in charge of it, and alcohol messed up his life, and he kind of didn't run it well. So he turned it over to the youngest son, Donald Trump. Or was he the middle son? Whatever, but to a younger son. And his dad said after their headquarters was in Brooklyn, and Trump wanted to go where the big boys, the big financial boys were, because Trump got a degree in finance. And so he went to where the big boys are, Manhattan, and moved their offices to Manhattan. And his dad said of him, everything he touches turns to gold. Now, I realize that's not totally true, but he's been very successful in the real estate market. Even when real estate went into some crises, he did that Chapter 11 stuff, came out of it better off than he went into it. And when he went into television, now I never watched his TV show, but apparently it was one of the big hits of TV. Everything he touched turned to gold. So he's been successful in a lot of different things, and even got some civil rights award from Jesse Jackson. Not that that's a big deal, but my point is he has been successful in everything he does, and I believe his presidency, those 4 years, America did not get involved in any more additional wars, and Hezbollah and Hamas kind of behaved themselves. And the Russians didn't invade anybody. China didn't do any excessive threatening of Taiwan. The world was at peace. Now, that's what you call leadership. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Of course, I don't know. I ask people to pray for America, that we get the best leadership we can get. Nobody's perfect, so unless you get Jesus Christ, nobody's perfect. But get the best leadership available. And then maybe this country and other countries can learn some lessons of what does work and what does not work. It looks like we keep doubling down on stupidity, like reimagining the police, telegraphing the whole world that our border is wide open. If we do this for another 5 years, can you imagine what this country is going to be like? It's giving us some thought. And appeasing dictators and allowing Iran, they took the sanctions off Iran, allowing the nexus of terrorism to have tons of money to finance rockets and all the things they do. We need better leadership and learn lessons. And we Christians need to learn to trust God for our protection. I'm not saying, I know how much protection we're going to need. It's hard to tell. America, there's persecution of Christians going on in the Hindu world, in the communist world, in the Middle Eastern world. But in our world, in America, so far it's only been light persecution. A country that can be criticized. Christianity can be criticized and made fun of. They wouldn't do that to any other religion. But beyond that, we don't get much persecution. But pray for protection of those who are getting it. And we know that on that Passover evening, at least 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died. And the Syrian Empire didn't dare fight the Egyptians. They just retreated back to Assyria, and that was the beginning of the end of that empire. because that king blasphemed God. Your God is no better than all those other gods. You're relying on Jehovah, not against my mighty army. He learned the lesson that God determines who wins and who loses. I mean, you think about it. George Washington took on the world's #1 empire, Great Britain. And in the War of 1812, Britain had just vanquished Napoleon. And we declared war on Britain. And both things worked out. Yeah, maybe you can argue the part about we tried to bring Canada in, that part didn't work out because I don't think God wanted it to work out that way. But size of army, size of navy doesn't determine victory. God determines victory. And something else I heard that's interesting. In Israel, there are a lot of Messianic Jews. These are Jews who believe that the Messiah came the first time, and they read and know the New Testament very well. They know the Old Testament well, too. And a lot of the Jewish rabbis didn't like these Messianic Jews because they, now this is from the Jewish perspective, Catholics, mostly Christians, but some Lutherans too, have persecuted Jews historically in Europe, and they have a long history of, go through it all. But you've heard about Spanish Inquisition and all kinds of things that happened to the Jews. So they think of Christians as an enemy. But they're starting to see American Christians come to their aid when they need it, and they're seeing the Messianic Jews coming to their aid as well. And the Jews over there are impressed. And they're now seeing Christianity as an ally and not as an enemy. And Jews are free, well, at least some of them, to become Messianic Jews without gaining the total hatred of all the rabbis. It's like a new change in Israel. Obviously, I don't know what's going to happen over there, so I don't want to say for sure, but it looks like there's some kind of revival in Israel. Not everybody, probably 30% of the public is radical secularists, and they'll stay that way, but Israel seems to be becoming more interested in God. I mean, most of the Jews. And even seeing those who believe Christ came the first time as not being so bad. A little bit of religious revival. So here's what I ask people to pray for. We should pray for the Jewish people and the IDF that are fighting. By the way, do you know that when the IDF gets ready to bomb a building, they send out a warning, like the civilians know we're going to bomb these tall buildings, get out of there, which of course helps their enemy, obviously. And they do things like that. Do they get any credit for it? No, they get blamed. And like this last attack, I think this is true at least, the Hezbollah sent a rocket and hit a soccer field where children were playing, killed 12 children, wounded 40, one or two others maybe hanging between life and death or something like that. Well, in the Israeli counterattack, they didn't go after civilians. They went after the leaders of Hezbollah. They took out, get my names right, they took out one in Tehran, the capital of Iran, which really shocked them. And then they took out one in the capital of Lebanon with a smart bomb that hit just the building he was on. They didn't go after, let's kill a bunch of Arab children. I mean, obviously, you might get some collateral damage, but that was not their target. They're going after the leaders who gave the order. And they don't get credit for it. The world is turning anti-Semitic, which is a signal that evil is rising, as you all kind of know. But pray for the Jewish people. Pray for the Church of God, that we get stronger, and all the different organizations, we get stronger. Pray for the Messianic Jews in the Middle East, and pray for the Church of God, that we can learn to trust God more, and pray for America, that we get the best government we can get under the circumstances. You're not going to get Jesus Christ no matter what you think, but we can get the best government we can under the circumstances, because I believe the devil is active. very active right now. And, well, we shall see. I don't think he likes the revival he sees in Israel and the Middle East. And some of the things that Trump did, like putting an organization against religious persecution and taking money away from abortion organizations, because that's their holy grail, it's a death culture. He doesn't like what he saw, and he's determined to screw this country up. So pray for America, and we all should learn to trust in God.